In this lecture, we're going to take a more focused examination of some of the example or some of the fundamental cells that make up the human organism. One fundamental cell, as indicated earlier, is the neuron. And the neuron is the functional unit, the most fundamental part of the nervous system. And we see that there are different types of neurons that exist within the central nervous system. One type is referred to as a pyramidal cell, and these are considered to be upper motor neurons. So these are neurons that exist within the brain that will eventually contribute to a motor function. And when we talk about a motor function, we're talking about the activation of muscle cells. We have what are called Purkinje cells. So there are some very fundamental common features between these different neurons, but there are some very unique differences between these neurons as well. So the Purkinje cell is typically found within a region of the central nervous system called the cerebellum. Basket cells are referred to as what are called inhibitory interneurons. So these are small, very short neurons that serve to connect other neurons to other neurons, hence being inter, which means between neurons. And they are inhibitory, which means that when this type of neuron is activated, it will prevent another neuron from becoming activated, thereby inhibiting activation of it. We have what are referred to as stellate cells in the central nervous system. And these are star-shaped neurons, which also have an inhibitory interneuron type of function. So these are very short types of neurons that will communicate between other neurons. And in this case, with basket cells and stellate cells, these cells will function when activated to inhibit the activation of other neurons. Some of the key features of neurons, which form the fundamental basis of nerve tissue, is that neurons have what are called soma, which is basically the cell body of these neurons. The purple illustration here within the soma represents the nucleus of this neuron. Neurons take in information from other neurons or from other activators. Those are the factors that will discharge this neuron. It could be heat, could be other chemicals, could be mechanical deformation. But dendrites typically take in information from other neurons typically. And so the dendrites represent input to the neuron that gets integrated through the cell body, and then that information will then get transmitted through what's called the axon. The axon in these neurons are very long and will interact with another cell. That other cell could be another neuron, or it could be a muscle cell or a cell of an endocrine organ. So the important aspect of neurons is that neurons are nature's communication system. These act as electrical wires, if you will, for the human organism, in that these are structures that communicate information, and they do so through various branches of the entire cell. And in this particular example of this particular neuron, here we see that this neuron will transmit information in the form of electrical energy down the axon or distally along the axon to where it will cause a response at the terminal end of this cell and do something, either activate or inhibit another cell. The other fundamental type of cell in the human organism are muscle cells. There are three basic types of muscle cells. We have skeletal muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells, and smooth muscle cells, particularly that we find within the cardiovascular system, with the exception of those cells that make up the mass of the heart of the organ. These are cells that are found uh, uh, located throughout the blood vessels as well as within the digestive system. And these are unique, all three are unique cells that are designed to contract, which is to say that proteins contained within these cells will produce force and cause these cells to change shape. This occurs voluntarily or involuntarily. So most skeletal muscle cells are activated in a voluntary manner so that we as humans make a conscious decision and to walk or to run or to sit down. Some skeletal muscle contracts involuntarily, such as the diaphragm muscle, which is the major muscle that brings air into the lungs. Cardiac muscle cells and smooth muscle cells are both considered to be involuntary type of cells. So some of the actions that are carried out when muscle cells contract is flexing of an arm, the pumping of blood through the out of the heart and into the cardiovascular system, or mixing food in the stomach, which the mass of the stomach is made up mostly of smooth muscle. The other type of basic cell, fundamental cell in the body, are epithelial cells that, when connected, forms what's called the epithelium, which is essentially a sheet-like layer of cells. And these are cells that line external body surfaces, such as the skin. Another example of an external body surface, although we don't typically think about our windpipe or trachea as external to the body, but it's considered physiologically external because within the trachea, within the hollow tube, is ambient air. And that ambient air is moved through the trachea eventually into the lungs. The epithelium also lines hollow organs and or vessels. One such example of a hollow organ is the small intestine of the digestive system. So whether the epithelium is in the trachea or deep in the lungs or in the small intestine, it serves one or two functions in that it functions as a barrier so as to prevent the absorption of molecules or ions that could be toxic to cells, or it could actually do the opposite as a transport membrane, which absorbs certain molecules or ions into the cell. And that's something that we rely on for the digestive system, where the digestive system will selectively absorb those life-sustaining molecules contained within food. So when we look at the digestive system, for example, the small intestine is somewhat circular in shape and has a hollow interior portion, which is where the food that we've consumed exists. That hollow interior region is referred to just simply as the lumen, which is composed of many more cells than what we see in this very simple illustration, but these are cells that are connected to each other that form this inner part of the digestive system, particularly in this example, the small intestine, that is connected to other thoracic and abdominal structures through what's called a basement membrane. The basement membrane is made up of a variety of different cells, including connective tissue type of cells, which helps to provide structure to the overall system. Some cells of the epithelium have these finger-like projections or hair-like projections called cilia or microvilli. And these function to to increase that surface area of the cells. And what we also see is that there is still a basement membrane which helps to anchor that epithelial sheet to other structures over which they are located adjacent to. The epithelium is also very important in the formation of glands. And in this illustration, we see two types of glands. We see what are called exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands are designed around the formation of what are called secretory cells that will produce chemicals or molecules and will move those molecules into a hollow interior region where those molecules will eventually move through a duct and will only enter one and only one anatomical location, the external environment. So one example of an external environment would be the interior of the stomach. So we think about the stomach as internal to the body. That's correct. However, the contents of the stomach were provided directly from the external environment in terms of food. So exocrine glands will produce compounds and chemicals and will secrete those compounds through a duct into a hollow opening for such as the stomach and only the interior of the stomach. That's quite a bit different than endocrine glands, which will produce compounds and will secrete those compounds directly into the cardiovascular system through into a blood vessel. So when we think about the cardiovascular system, we have to think about a continuous flow of blood throughout the entire body. So as endocrine glands produces what are called hormones, and those hormones will get secreted, will move through the cells that make up the gland and the cells that make up the smallest vessels of the cardiovascular system, which are capillaries. They will then move from those secretory cells into the cardiovascular system and will flow throughout the entire body and potentially alter the physiology of many different tissues. Some hormones are designed by nature to affect only one type of tissue, but the major difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands is that exocrine glands will produce compounds that are directed to one and only one location, whereas endocrine glands will produce compounds that could potentially reach many, many different locations. So this ends this part of our Unit 1 lecture on the different types of cells and tissues.